Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she counted the coins spread across her kitchen table for the third time, hoping somehow the numbers would magically change, and she'd find enough to cover both the electric bill and her daughter Emma's school supplies. The fluorescent light above buzzed and flickered, threatening to go out completely, which felt like a perfect metaphor for her entire life at that moment. She'd been working double shifts at Morrison's diner for 6 months straight, ever since her ex-husband had disappeared without paying a single month of child support, leaving her to figure out how to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. The diner job wasn't glamorous, but it had been steady, and the tips from the regular customers who sat in her section had made the difference between barely making it and not making it at all. Sarah pushed back a strand of dark hair that had escaped from her ponytail and glanced at the stack of bills piled next to her ancient laptop, each one stamped with increasingly aggressive red letters demanding payment. The eviction notice sat on top, giving her exactly 14 days to come up with 3 months of back rent or find herself and Emma on the street. She'd been behind before, had managed to scrape together enough to keep the landlord at bay, but this time felt different. This time she could see the edge of the cliff approaching, and no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't seem to stop moving toward it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor Mrs. Chen, who'd been watching Emma after school for a reduced rate because she understood what it meant to struggle. The message was simple and warm, telling her that Emma had finished her homework and was watching cartoons, but Sarah still felt the guilt gnaw at her insides because she should be the one helping with homework and making dinner and tucking her daughter into bed. Instead, she was here counting pennies and trying to figure out which bill to pay first. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of sirens somewhere in the city, and Sarah felt the weight of every decision she'd ever made pressing down on her shoulders. She'd dropped out of college when she got pregnant, had believed her ex when he promised they'd figure it out together, had taken the first job she could find that would work around Emma's schedule. Now she was 32 years old with a high school diploma, a 7-year-old daughter, and a future that looked increasingly bleak. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass and looking down at the street below where a few people hurried past, all of them probably heading home to lives that didn't involve counting coins at midnight. She thought about her daughter's face when she'd asked for new sneakers last week, the way Emma had quickly added that her old ones were fine when she saw the worry flash across Sarah's face. That moment had broken something in her, made her realize that Emma was learning to shrink her needs, to make herself smaller so her mother wouldn't have to stress, and that wasn't the lesson Sarah wanted to teach. She wanted Emma to dream big, to believe the world was full of possibilities, but how could she teach that when their reality was so harsh? The eviction notice seemed to pulse with menace from the table, and Sarah knew she'd have to face Mr. Kowalski in the morning, would have to beg for more time even though she'd already begged twice before. She'd never imagined her life would look like this, had dreamed of becoming a teacher, of having a house with a yard where Emma could play, of stability and security and maybe even happiness. Instead, she was living paycheck to paycheck in a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a landlord who was running out of patience. Sarah returned to the table and began sorting the bills by due date, a strategy that at least gave her the illusion of control, and tried not to think about what would happen if she couldn't find a way out of this hole. Tomorrow she had the early shift at Morrison's, would have to be there by 5:30 in the morning to set up for the breakfast rush, and she still needed to pick up Emma from Mrs. Chen's and make sure she had clean clothes for school. The exhaustion was bone deep now, the kind that sleep didn't really fix anymore, but Sarah couldn't afford to slow down or take a break because the moment she stopped moving was the moment everything would fall apart. The pre-dawn darkness still clung to the streets when Sarah pushed through the back door of Morrison's diner, her breath forming small clouds in the November air. As she hurried toward the employee entrance, she was running 5 minutes late, which meant Dennis, the manager, would probably make some snide comment about responsibility and commitment, as if she hadn't proven both 100 times over by showing up every single day regardless of how exhausted or stressed she felt. The diner sat on the corner of 8th and Broadway, a location that had once been prime real estate when this part of downtown was thriving, but now existed in that gray zone where the city was trying to rebrand as up and coming, while everyone who actually lived there knew it was just poor. Sarah fumbled with her keys, finally getting the door open and slipping inside to the familiar smell of coffee and bacon grease that had soaked into every surface over the diner's 40-year existence. She clocked in, tied her apron and started the opening routine she could do in her sleep, brewing the first pots of coffee and checking that the condiment stations were fully stocked. The diner wouldn't officially open for another 20 minutes, but she could already see a few regulars gathering outside, waiting for their usual spots at the counter where they'd nurse cups of coffee and raid newspapers and complain about everything from the weather to the mayor. Sarah was wiping down the front counter when she noticed him through the window, a man standing on the sidewalk just beyond the diner's glow, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing that looked like they'd been pulled from donation bins or garbage cans. He wasn't doing anything threatening, just standing there with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, occasionally stamping his feet against the cold, and something about his posture, the way he seemed to be trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable, made Sarah's chest tighten. She'd seen plenty of homeless people in this neighborhood, had served them when they managed to scrape together enough change for a cup of coffee, but this man looked different somehow, more lost than the others, like he'd only recently found himself on the streets and hadn't quite learned how to survive there yet. Dennis emerged from the office, clipboard in hand, already wearing his perpetual expression of mild irritation that seemed to be his default setting. He glanced out the window, noticed the homeless man, and immediately his face hardened into something uglier. Without a word he marched to the door, unlocked it and stepped outside, and Sarah watched through the glass as he made sharp gestures, telling the man to move along, that this wasn't a shelter and loitering wasn't allowed. The homeless man nodded and started to shuffle away, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, some combination of anger and compassion that overrode her usual caution. She grabbed a large coffee cup, filled it with fresh brew, added cream and sugar, and wrapped a blueberry muffin in a napkin. Before Dennis could come back inside and stop her, she pushed through the door and called out to the man who had made it maybe 20 feet down the sidewalk. He turned slowly, confusion and wariness written across a face that was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-40s, with eyes that still held some spark of the person he'd been before whatever series of disasters had landed him here. Sarah held out the coffee and muffin, her breath forming small clouds between them as she explained quickly that it wasn't much but it might help, that everyone deserved breakfast and warmth, that she hoped things would get better for him soon. The man's eyes filled with tears that he quickly blinked away, and his hands shook slightly as he accepted the offerings, not from cold but from something deeper, from the shock of being treated like a human being instead of a problem to be moved along. He thanked her in a voice rough from disuse, told her she didn't know what this meant to him, and Sarah just smiled and said she hoped he'd stay warm before hurrying back inside where Dennis was already waiting with a storm cloud expression and a lecture about company policy and how they couldn't just give away food and supplies to every person who showed up looking pathetic. Dennis didn't waste time with pleasantries or privacy, launching into his tirade right there in the middle of the diner, where the early morning customers were starting to filter in and claim their usual spots. His voice carried across the space as he told Sarah that what she'd done was theft, that the coffee and muffin came out of the diner's inventory, and therefore out of his bottom line, and that he'd been looking for a reason to cut staff anyway since business had been slow. Sarah felt her face flush hot with anger and embarrassment as every head in the diner turned to watch the show, as Dennis made a spectacle of her compassion and turned it into something shameful. She tried to explain that she'd intended to pay for the items herself, that it was barely $2 worth of food, but Dennis was on a roll now, feeding off his own authority and the attention of the audience. He told her that it didn't matter what her intentions were, that rules existed for a reason, and that if he let her get away with giving handouts, then every employee would think they could do the same, and pretty soon they'd have a line of homeless people stretching around the block, expecting free meals. The words kept coming, each one designed to cut deeper, to make Sarah feel small and stupid for thinking that kindness mattered more than policy. She stood there taking it because she needed this job, because walking out would mean Emma didn't eat, wouldn't mean proving a point or taking a stand, but rather would mean sliding faster toward that edge she'd been trying so desperately to avoid. But then Dennis said something about how people like that homeless man were probably drug addicts anyway and didn't deserve help from hard-working people, and something inside Sarah snapped like a wire pulled too tight. She heard herself telling Dennis that maybe if he spent less time worrying about $2 worth of coffee and more time being an actual human being, he wouldn't be a middle-aged man whose only power came from bullying waitresses in a rundown diner. The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah watched Dennis's face cycle through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested an imminent stroke. His response was immediate and final. She was fired, effective immediately, needed to turn in her apron and clock out and be gone in 5 minutes. Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her as the reality of what she'd just done crashed down, as the anger drained away and left only panic in its wake. She'd just sacrificed the only income she had for the sake of pride and principle, had chosen to defend a stranger over her own daughter's stability, and the weight of that decision made it hard to breathe. The other waitresses, Carla and Michelle, both looked away when Sarah glanced in their direction, neither willing to risk their own jobs by offering support or sympathy. The customers had mostly returned to their newspapers and phones, the entertainment over, though Sarah caught a few sympathetic glances from the regulars who'd always tipped well and asked about Emma. She untied her apron with shaking hands, balled it up and threw it on the counter with more force than necessary, and walked to the back to clock out for the last time. In the employee area, surrounded by the lockers and the time clock and the schedule board that no longer included her name, Sarah let herself feel the full scope of what had just happened. She'd been fired for showing basic human decency, and while part of her knew she'd made the right choice, that standing up to Dennis's cruelty mattered, the larger part was already calculating how many days she had before the eviction became final, before the utilities got shut off, before she'd have to explain to Emma why they were packing their things into garbage bags. Sarah grabbed her purse from her locker and walked back through the diner without looking at anyone, her head held high even as her heart hammered against her ribs and her mind raced through increasingly desperate options. The morning sun was starting to break over the buildings as she stepped outside, and somewhere down the block she could see the homeless man sitting on a bench, slowly sipping the coffee she'd given him, completely unaware that his breakfast had cost her everything. The days after getting fired blurred together into a nightmare of job applications and mounting panic that Sarah couldn't quite shake, no matter how many deep breaths she took or how many times she told herself it would work out somehow. She spent her mornings on the computer filling out applications for everything from retail positions to office work to other restaurant jobs, each one requiring her to explain gaps in her work history and provide references and pretend that she was the ideal candidate they'd been searching for all along. The responses, when they came at all, were universally depressing form letters thanking her for her interest, but informing her they'd decided to pursue other candidates whose qualifications better matched their needs. Sarah started to understand how people fell through the cracks, how quickly the safety net dissolved when you didn't have savings or family or backup plans, how the difference between making it and not making it was often just 1 or 2 missed paychecks. She'd called her landlord Mr. Kowalski the day after getting fired, had explained the situation and asked for more time, but his patience had finally run out, and he'd told her in a voice that managed to sound both sympathetic and final that he couldn't carry her anymore, that he had his own bills to pay. The eviction would proceed as scheduled unless she could come up with the full amount owed, which they both knew wasn't going to happen. Emma seemed to sense that something was wrong, had grown quieter over dinner, asked fewer questions, and Sarah hated that her 7-year-old daughter was learning to read her moods and adjust her behavior accordingly. She wanted Emma to feel safe and secure, wanted to protect her from the harsh realities of their situation, but it was becoming impossible to hide the stress and fear that followed Sarah around like a shadow. The apartment felt smaller each day, the walls closing in as the pile of unpaid bills grew and Sarah's options dwindled to almost nothing. She'd swallowed her pride and called her mother, even though they'd barely spoken since Sarah had gotten pregnant and her mother had made it clear she disapproved of every choice her daughter had made. The conversation had been brief and painful, her mother's voice cold as she explained that she'd warned Sarah this would happen, that bad decisions led to bad consequences, and that she wasn't in a position to provide financial assistance to someone who clearly couldn't manage their own life. Sarah had hung up feeling worse than before she'd called, the old wounds torn open, fresh and bleeding, the message clear that she was alone in this and would have to find her own way out. She'd started looking at homeless shelters, researching the process for getting into transitional housing, preparing herself for the very real possibility that she and Emma would soon be among the people she'd served coffee and sympathy to at Morrison's diner. The irony wasn't lost on her the way life could flip so quickly from server to served, from housed to homeless, from hanging on by your fingernails to free-falling with nothing to grab onto. Sarah lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma's soft breathing from the couch where she slept, and tried to figure out where everything had gone so wrong. She'd made mistakes, sure, had trusted the wrong person and gotten pregnant too young and dropped out of school, but were those crimes really worthy of this punishment? Did one act of kindness toward a stranger really deserve to cost her everything she'd been working so hard to maintain? The questions circled endlessly in her mind, offering no answers, no comfort, no solution. She'd applied to 23 jobs in 4 days and received 19 rejections, with 4 still pending, and the math was becoming increasingly clear that time was running out faster than opportunities were appearing. Sarah pulled herself off the couch and returned to the computer, the blue glow of the screen harsh in the darkness of the apartment, and opened another job listing, this one for a night shift position at a warehouse that paid minimum wage, and required her to figure out childcare during hours when most people were sleeping. She started filling out the application anyway because what else could she do? Giving up wasn't an option when Emma was depending on her, when failure meant her daughter would pay the price for her mother's choices. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard automatically, answering questions about her availability and experience, while her mind drifted to that morning at the diner, to the homeless man's grateful face, to the decision that had seemed so clear and right in the moment, but had led to this slow-motion disaster. Sarah had just finished explaining to Emma that they might need to stay with Mrs. Chen for a little while, carefully avoiding words like evicted or homeless, while trying to prepare her daughter for the upheaval that was now less than a week away, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another bill collector or scam call, but something made her swipe to accept, her voice cautious as she said hello to whoever was on the other end. The woman who responded was professional and courteous, introducing herself as Linda Chen from Hartwell Industries and asking if she could speak with Sarah Mitchell regarding an employment opportunity. Sarah's first thought was that this had to be some kind of mistake, that she'd never applied to any company called Hartwell Industries, but Linda continued smoothly, explaining that Sarah's name had been brought to the attention of their executive team, and they were interested in discussing a position that might suit her skills and experience. Sarah sat down heavily on the couch, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing, wondering if this was some elaborate prank or if she'd somehow entered an alternate reality where things actually worked out for people like her. Linda asked if Sarah would be available for an interview that afternoon at the company's downtown headquarters, and Sarah heard herself agreeing even though she had no idea what kind of position they could possibly want to discuss with someone whose most recent work experience involved getting fired from a diner for giving away coffee. The address Linda provided was in the financial district in one of those gleaming glass towers that Sarah had only ever seen from the outside, and as she hung up the phone she felt a strange mixture of hope and suspicion that maybe this was too good to be true. She spent the next 2 hours in a panic, trying to figure out what to wear to an interview at a company she'd never heard of for a position that hadn't been described, settling finally on the one semi-professional outfit she owned, a black skirt and white blouse that she usually reserved for parent-teacher conferences. Emma watched from the couch as Sarah applied makeup with shaking hands, trying to cover the dark circles and exhaustion that had become permanent features of her face, and asked where her mom was going dressed so fancy. Sarah explained that she had a job interview, that it might be really good news for them, and Emma's face lit up with the kind of pure hope that children could still manage before life taught them to be cynical. The bus ride downtown felt surreal, the cityscape changing from the worn buildings of her neighborhood to the pristine corporate architecture of the financial district, and Sarah kept checking the address on her phone to make sure she'd gotten it right. Hartwell Industries occupied floors 15 through 20 of a building so tall that Sarah had to crane her neck to see the top, all glass and steel reflecting the autumn sky. The lobby was the kind of space designed to intimidate, with marble floors and modern art installations and a security desk where visitors had to check in and receive passes. Sarah gave her name to the security guard, who checked his computer and nodded, directing her to a specific elevator bank that would take her to the executive floor. The elevator ride felt like ascending to another world, the numbers ticking higher as Sarah tried to calm her racing heart and prepare herself for whatever was about to happen. The doors opened onto a reception area that looked like something from a magazine, all clean lines and expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city spread out below. Linda Chen turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile, who greeted Sarah like an expected guest rather than a waitress who'd stumbled into the wrong building. She led Sarah down a hallway lined with glass-walled offices, where people in expensive suits sat having meetings and making phone calls, all of them moving with the confidence of people who knew their place in the world and weren't worried about paying rent. Linda stopped at a conference room and gestured for Sarah to enter, and as Sarah stepped through the doorway she saw a man sitting at the table, and her breath caught in her throat because she recognized him immediately despite the tailored suit and clean-shaven face. It was the homeless man from outside the diner, except he wasn't homeless at all, was in fact sitting in what was clearly his conference room in his building, looking at her with an expression that mixed apology and something else, something that might have been respect. The man stood up as Sarah entered, extending his hand and introducing himself as Marcus Hartwell, founder and CEO of Hartwell Industries, and Sarah felt like she'd stepped into some kind of elaborate television show where nothing was quite real. Her mind was struggling to connect the person in front of her, perfectly groomed and radiating the kind of authority that came with actual power, with the man who'd been standing outside Morrison's diner, wrapped in rags and gratefully accepting a cup of coffee and a muffin. Marcus gestured for her to sit, his voice gentle as he acknowledged that she must be confused and probably a little angry, that he owed her an explanation for what must seem like a cruel deception. He explained that he'd been conducting what he called an undercover assessment, spending weeks living on the streets and interacting with his own employees and the general public to understand how people treated those they perceived as beneath them. Hartwell Industries was a company built on the principle that character mattered more than credentials, that how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching revealed their true nature. Marcus had visited dozens of businesses, had been ignored and insulted and moved along by security guards and managers, had experienced firsthand the invisibility that came with being homeless in a city that preferred to pretend poverty didn't exist. He'd been outside Morrison's diner by chance, drawn by the smell of coffee and the warmth visible through the windows, and had no intention of going inside until the manager had come out and aggressively told him to move along. Then Sarah had appeared with coffee and kindness, treating him like a human being worthy of basic decency, and he'd watched through the window as she'd gotten fired for that simple act of compassion. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, and told Sarah that he'd had her situation investigated, not in a creepy way but in a practical way, understanding that she was a single mother, struggling to make ends meet who'd just sacrificed her job for the sake of doing what was right. The investigation had revealed her work history, her reliability, the way other employees and customers consistently described her as kind and hard-working, the recommendations from people who'd seen her manage difficult situations with grace. Hartwell Industries was expanding their corporate social responsibility division, creating programs to help lift people out of poverty and create pathways to employment for those who'd been overlooked by traditional systems. They needed someone to lead the initiative who understood struggle firsthand, who had empathy born from experience rather than theory, someone who'd proven they'd choose integrity over self-preservation, even when the cost was high. Marcus was offering Sarah the position of Director of Community Outreach, a role that came with a salary that made her eyes water when he mentioned the number, full benefits including health insurance and retirement contributions, and the resources to actually make a difference in people's lives. Sarah sat frozen, her mind trying to process the massive shift her life had just taken, trying to reconcile the eviction notice sitting on her kitchen table with the job offer being presented in this conference room 40 floors above the street. She wanted to accept immediately, wanted to cry with relief and gratitude, but some part of her was still waiting for the catch, for the reveal that this was all some elaborate prank or mistake. Marcus seemed to understand her hesitation, pulling out a folder and sliding it across the table, telling her to take it home and review the offer details, that he didn't expect an immediate answer even though he hoped she'd say yes. Inside the folder was a formal offer letter, a detailed job description, information about the company's benefits and values, and a check made out to Sarah Mitchell for an amount that would cover her back rent and bills with enough left over to breathe for the first time in months. Marcus explained that the check was an advance on her first month's salary, that he understood she was facing immediate financial crisis and wanted to remove that pressure from her decision-making process. He told Sarah that she deserved this opportunity not despite her circumstances, but because of them, that the world needed more people who'd choose compassion, even when it was costly, and that he'd be honored if she'd accept the position and help build something meaningful. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face before she even realized she was crying, all the stress and fear and exhaustion of the past week pouring out as relief and disbelief and hope crashed over her in waves. She managed to thank Marcus through her tears, to tell him she didn't know what to say, and he just smiled and handed her a box of tissues and told her to take her time, that some moments were bigger than words. 3 months after that surreal meeting in the Hartwell Industries conference room, Sarah found herself standing in her own office with her name on the door, and a team of 6 people who reported to her and looked to her for guidance and vision. The transition hadn't been seamless, had required long hours of learning and training, and figuring out how to navigate corporate culture after years of existing in the service industry trenches. But Sarah had discovered she was good at this work, that her experiences had given her insights and perspectives that no amount of formal education could provide. The Community Outreach Division had launched with an ambitious program partnering with local shelters and job training organizations, creating pathways for homeless individuals and struggling families to gain employment skills and find positions within Hartwell Industries and partner companies. Sarah had insisted on a holistic approach, recognizing that employment alone wasn't enough if people were also dealing with housing instability, childcare challenges, health issues, and the 1,000 other problems that came with poverty. The program provided support services, connected participants with resources, and most importantly treated every person with dignity and respect regardless of where they were starting from. Sarah thought often about Dennis at Morrison's Diner, about how his small-minded cruelty had inadvertently led to her standing here in a position where she could actually help people instead of just serving them coffee and sympathy. She'd returned to the diner once, not to gloat but to thank Dennis in a strange way, to let him know that firing her had opened a door she never would have walked through otherwise. He'd been predictably defensive, had tried to justify his actions and claim he'd had no choice, and Sarah had just smiled and left him with the knowledge that his cruelty had failed to break her. The program's first graduating class included 12 participants, all of whom had secured full-time employment with benefits, and Sarah had stood at the ceremony, watching them receive their certificates with tears streaming down her face because she understood what this meant, how it felt to be given a chance when the world had written you off. Among the graduates was a woman named Teresa who'd been living in her car with her 2 kids, who'd told Sarah that the program had saved her family, and Sarah had hugged her and whispered that they'd saved each other. Emma was thriving too, enrolled in a better school now that they'd moved to a larger apartment in a safer neighborhood, no longer worried about whether they'd have enough food or whether the lights would stay on. She'd adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience of children, but sometimes Sarah caught her daughter looking around their home with wonder, as if she still couldn't quite believe this was real. Sarah had made sure to explain to Emma that their situation had changed because of kindness, because helping someone who needed it had somehow circled back around to help them, and she wanted her daughter to learn that compassion wasn't weakness, but rather the strongest choice a person could make. The job was demanding and sometimes overwhelming, requiring Sarah to learn new skills and navigate complex organizational politics, while managing a team and overseeing budgets and reporting to executives who occasionally questioned whether investing in social programs was good business. But Marcus had her back, would show up at her presentations and publicly support her initiatives, making it clear that this work was central to the company's values and not some peripheral charity project. Sarah had developed a friendship with Marcus built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it meant to struggle, though she still occasionally thought about that morning outside the diner, and wondered what would have happened if she'd made a different choice. The answer was both simple and terrifying. She'd still be broke and desperate, would probably be homeless by now, would be living proof of how quickly the system could fail people who were already hanging on by a thread. Instead, she was here, making more money than she'd ever dreamed possible, and using it to create stability not just for herself and Emma, but for others who'd been dealt bad hands and needed someone to believe they deserved better. Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification about an upcoming meeting with potential corporate partners who wanted to replicate their program model, and she grabbed her tablet and headed to the conference room, passing by the reception area where Linda Chen smiled and waved. The city spread out beyond the windows, the same city where she'd once counted pennies and feared eviction, and Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the weird and unpredictable way her life had unfolded. She'd lost everything for the sake of a cup of coffee and a muffin, and somehow that loss had transformed into this new beginning, this opportunity to matter in ways she'd never imagined possible. On the one-year anniversary of her firing from Morrison's diner, Sarah woke up before her alarm and lay in bed for a moment, just appreciating how different her life looked now, how far she'd traveled from that desperate woman counting coins at a kitchen table. She'd established herself as a respected voice in corporate social responsibility, had been invited to speak at conferences and contribute to industry publications, had built something sustainable and meaningful that was changing lives in measurable ways. The numbers backed up the impact, showing that participants in their program had a 92% job retention rate after 6 months, that families were achieving stability and children were staying in school, that the investment in people was paying dividends not just in feel-good stories, but in actual economic outcomes. But for Sarah, the real measure of success wasn't in the statistics or the accolades, but in the individual faces of people who'd been given chances and made the most of them, who'd proven that poverty wasn't a character flaw, but a circumstance that could change with the right support. She'd received a letter last week from a man named James who'd been living in a shelter when he entered the program, and was now working in Hartwell Industries' IT department and saving for a down payment on a house. He'd written that Sarah had restored his faith in humanity, had shown him that someone cared whether he succeeded or failed, and reading those words had made Sarah cry the way she'd cried in Marcus's office that first day when everything had shifted. Sarah got dressed in one of the professional outfits she'd gradually acquired as her wardrobe evolved to match her new role, kissed Emma goodbye as her daughter headed off to school with her backpack and lunch money, and all the security of a child who didn't have to worry about whether there'd be dinner that night. The commute downtown had become routine now, the glass tower no longer intimidating but familiar, her security pass granting access without the nervous checking and rechecking that had characterized those first few weeks. She had meetings scheduled all day, including one with a potential donor who wanted to fund an expansion of the program to 3 additional cities, but Sarah had blocked off her morning for something personal. She'd packed a bag with coffee thermoses and breakfast sandwiches and pastries, had loaded everything into her car before heading to the office, and now she drove to the neighborhood where Morrison's diner still stood on the corner of 8th and Broadway. The area hadn't changed much, was still that gray zone between gentrification and neglect, and Sarah parked her car and walked the blocks she used to walk when this was her commute, when the diner had been her entire world, and the future had seemed impossibly bleak. She found them in the places she'd expected, the homeless individuals who congregated near the shelter and the community center, the ones who stood outside businesses hoping for loose change or leftover food. Sarah approached each person with the same respect Marcus had taught her, asking their names and offering hot coffee and breakfast, sitting on benches and listening to their stories without judgment or pity. There was a woman named Dee Dee who'd lost her housing after a medical emergency wiped out her savings, a veteran named Carl who was waiting for disability benefits to process through a bureaucratic system that moved slower than human need, a young man named Tyler who'd aged out of foster care and was trying to figure out how to survive without the support structure most people took for granted. Sarah gave them her business card along with the food, told them about the program, explained that if they were interested in employment and stability there were people who wanted to help make that possible. Some of them looked at the card with skepticism, had heard promises before that never materialized, but others clutched it like a lifeline and asked questions about how the process worked and whether someone like them could really qualify. Sarah assured them that everyone qualified, that the only requirement was willingness to try, and she could see hope flickering in eyes that had learned not to expect good things. She spent 2 hours doing what she'd been fired for doing, providing basic human decency to people society preferred to ignore, except now she had resources and power and the ability to offer more than just temporary comfort. As she was packing up to head to the office, Sarah saw Dennis through the diner window, still wearing his manager's shirt and probably still terrorizing his staff with petty power plays and rigid adherence to policies that prioritized profits over people. She felt a surge of pity for him, understanding now that his cruelty came from his own insecurity and smallness, his need to feel superior to someone because he'd never found real purpose or meaning in his life. Sarah could have made a grand gesture of showing him how far she'd risen while he'd stayed exactly where he'd always been, but she chose instead to simply walk past, releasing whatever anger or resentment she'd carried and letting him exist in his small world while she focused on expanding her. The office was buzzing when she arrived, her team preparing for the donor meeting and updating presentations with the latest success metrics. Sarah reviewed the materials, added her notes and suggestions, and felt that familiar sense of purpose that came from doing work that actually mattered. Marcus stopped by her office before the meeting asking how her morning had gone, and Sarah told him about the people she'd met and the business cards she'd distributed. He smiled and said that was exactly the kind of leadership he'd been hoping for, someone who never forgot where they came from and used their position to lift others rather than just climb higher themselves. The donor meeting went well, resulted in a commitment of funding that would allow them to triple their program capacity, and afterwards Sarah's team celebrated with coffee and pastries in the conference room, everyone energized by the possibilities ahead. Sarah looked around at the faces of her colleagues, a diverse group of people who'd been drawn to this work because they believed in second chances and systemic change, and felt grateful for the community they'd built together. That evening, Sarah picked up Emma from her after-school program and took her for ice cream, a Friday tradition they'd established once money was no longer a constant source of stress. Emma talked about her day, about the science project she was working on and the field trip coming up next month, and Sarah listened with full attention, no longer distracted by worries about bills or evictions or how they'd survive the next crisis. On the drive home, Emma asked her mom if she ever thought about that time when things were really hard, and Sarah admitted that she thought about it often, that remembering where they'd been made her appreciate where they were. She told Emma that the hardest time in their lives had taught her the most important lesson, that choosing kindness even when it cost you everything was still the right choice, that treating people with dignity and compassion was never a mistake even if it looked like one in the moment. Emma considered this seriously, then announced that when she grew up she wanted to help people too, wanted to make sure nobody had to be scared or hungry or worried about having a place to sleep. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed her daughter's hand and told her she'd be amazing at it, that the world needed people like Emma who cared about making things better. They pulled into the parking lot of their apartment building, the nice one with the playground and the security gate and the neighbors who smiled and said hello, and Sarah felt a wave of contentment wash over her. Her life wasn't perfect, still had challenges and stresses and moments of doubt, but it was fundamentally stable and secure in ways she'd stopped believing were possible during those dark days of counting pennies and facing eviction. Sarah had learned that sometimes the worst moments were actually doorways to better things, that losing everything could paradoxically be the first step toward gaining something more valuable than what you'd lost. As she and Emma walked toward their apartment, Sarah looked up at the evening sky turning purple and orange with sunset, and sent a silent thank you to the universe for the homeless CEO who'd been testing humanity and found it in the kindness of a struggling waitress, for the firing that had freed her from a dead-end job and pointed her toward a meaningful career, for the hard lessons that had shaped her into someone capable of creating change. Life had a strange way of working out, Sarah thought as she unlocked their door and Emma bounded inside, calling dibs on choosing the movie for their Friday night tradition. You could lose your job for giving a homeless man coffee, and somehow that loss could transform into finding yourself standing in an office with your name on the door, leading programs that helped hundreds of people build better lives, proving that compassion wasn't weakness but the strongest foundation on which to build a future. Sarah smiled and followed her daughter inside, closing the door on the past and stepping fully into the present, ready for whatever came next, because she'd learned the most important truth, that doing the right thing always mattered, even when the cost seemed too high, even when the rewards weren't immediately visible, even when the world tried to punish you for choosing humanity over self-preservation. In the end, kindness had saved her, and now she spent every day making sure it could save others.